Hello! Today I want to show you how to make two knitted items at once on the same set of knitting needles. You can do this for mittens and gloves or even for hats, any small item that you want to turn out to be the same size. This is also great for knitting sweater sleeves and similar items. The first thing you'll need to know is what kind of knitting needles to use. You'll need a set of circular needles with a long cord. You'll need at least a 29-inch cord. I like to use a 36-inch cord because I feel like it gives me just a little bit more room to work. The second thing you need to know is that you should split your yarn into two balls, one for each separate item. I'm going to be using two different colors of yarn today so you can see where the stitches change just a little bit more easily, but you may want to use the same color of yarn so that your two items match. The first thing you do to get started is to choose your first ball of yarn. We'll use the blue as our color 1, and we'll do a normal long tail cast on for the item that we're going to make. So pull out your tail. I'm going to make a little tiny baby hat, and it calls for 40 stitches cast on. So go ahead and make your slip knot. Take that slip knot and place it on one of the needle ends. And simply cast on. The difference here when you're going to make two separate items on one set of needles is you're going to cast on half the stitches that your pattern calls for. So since my pattern calls for 40 stitches, I will be casting on 20 stitches to get started with the color 1, and then we stop. And you just do your normal cast on. I like the long tail because it makes a stretchy little end. Let's count how many stitches we have here. We want to make sure we get to 20. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So that is your step 1 when you're going to cast on two different items. You want to cast on half the stitches that your pattern calls for in color number 1 or with yarn ball number 1. Now for step number 2, when you're casting on two items at once, you slide those first 20 stitches or the first set of stitches, depending on what your pattern is called for, down to the end of the first needle and move color number 1 or ball number 1 aside. Then you take color number 2 and you're going to do another cast on for your second item. So this will be our second hat. And since our pattern calls for 40 stitches, we'll cast on 40 stitches with color number 2 or yarn ball number 2. The second set of stitches, you cast on all of the stitches that your pattern calls for. So we'll go ahead and cast on 40 stitches here for step number 2. That should be 40, but you always want to double check at this point because once you've moved on to the next step, you can't go back. So once you have all your stitches cast on, you double check. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, 36, 38, and 40 stitches. So, as you can see, on step 2, you're going to have your first set of stitches will be half of what the pattern has called for, and your second set of stitches is all of the cast on stitches that the pattern calls for. Now for step 3, you are going to pick up both needles at this point, and you're going to take the first set of stitches, the color 1 stitches, and slide them around to the second needle. So just slide them back, being careful not to twist them. Keep them straight so that the bottom of your item will be nice and neat. And slide those all the way to the tip of the other needle, of the empty needle of your circular needles. Just like that. Then take the color 1 stitches, the color 2 stitches, the purple stitches in this case, and you're going to split those in half. So you're going to count half the stitches. For me, that's 20 stitches. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. And at this point, you're going to slide it. You're going to take that little cable cord and you're going to very gently pull it through. Be careful not to twist your stitches while you're doing this. And one way to double check that your stitches are not twisted is on the back needle. You'll see sort of a purl side. See the little bumps, the purl side? Those will need to face you on the back needle. And on the front needle, you'll see it's a little neater, it's more of a knit side. So the purl side stitches will face you on the back needle, and the knit side stitches will face you on the front needle. And that's how you know that you're not all twisted up, is you want all the little purl sides to face you and all the little knit sides to face you on the front needle. All right, now the very next step you take is to cast on the second half of your stitches with your first color, your color 1 or your ball 1. And you'll do that in the same way that you cast on any other long tail stitches. Make sure that the tail of the yarn will be draped over your thumb and the working yarn draped over your pointer finger or your first finger. And there'll be a little X here at the bottom, and you're going to cast on to the first needle. And you cast on half the stitches your pattern calls for, so that you'll have all of the stitches that you need to cast on the needles when you're done. So we'll be casting on 20 stitches to finish out our pattern. And 20. And again, always double check here and make sure you've cast on the right amount of stitches so that you match your pattern. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. All right, so we have all of the stitches we need cast on to make 2 separate items following my baby hat pattern. And when you're done casting on, go through and untangle a little bit. If you keep untangling as you go, you'll have a lot less problem when you turn and you make your first row. So as you can see, I've made my long tails quite a bit too long. So right now is a really good time to go ahead and clip them off at about 10 to 12 inches. I wouldn't do any longer than that or you can get tangled, but don't go too much shorter either or you're going to have a hard time weaving them in. All right, so now you've cast on all the stitches and you're ready to move forward to making your first row when you're knitting 2 items at once on the same set of needles. All right, now that we've cast on all of our stitches, how do you start to knit your first row? Well, first thing you'll do is you'll take the cast on stitches that have been in your right hand and you're going to turn the entire piece over. So all of the working stitches, all of the live stitches are going to be in your left hand now. And it'll be sitting just like this. Next, you take your back needle and you gently, without twisting your stitches, be very careful not to twist your stitches, gently slide that needle through and you're going to turn it around and you'll be working with your right hand, pulling the live stitches from your left hand as you work. So you start with your ball number 1 or your color number 1. Again, make sure you don't twist your stitches. You want to see sort of the knit side of the cast on facing you on the front needle and the purl side of the cast on facing you on the back needle. That helps you not get all twisted on this first row. Now you'll get your first color of yarn or your first ball of yarn and you're going to work from that. Now sometimes these 2 balls get tangled and you just untwist them as you go. So don't get too worried about that. As long as you don't start getting knots, little twists here and there are okay. You can untwist it as you work. So my pattern wants me to knit purl the first row. So you simply knit into the first stitch and follow your pattern. Knit and purl for my entire first row. You'll be working half of the stitches that the pattern has called for, just as you cast on half of the stitches that the pattern called for with your color number 1. And then you'll be switching on to color number 2 once you've reached the end. And purl. Okay. Now at this point, you've completed half of your first row of your first piece. Take that first color of yarn and just set it down. I'm starting to get a little tangled, so let's untwist here. And we're going to move to color number 2 for our first set of color number 2 stitches that are on our needles. As you can see, you want to make sure you match up the yarn from the working ball with the stitches that are on your needles. If you kept working with number 1, you'd end up having your 2 items tied together. So make sure at the end of that first set of stitches you drop color or ball number 1 and pick up color or ball number 2. And then you follow the pattern the same way. Again, it wants me to knit purl, so we go ahead and we knit with color number 2 and purl with color number 2 all the way to the middle of that first row. So you're only doing half the stitches of the pattern on each side of the needle. So we'll have 20 on this side before we turn our needles. And just gently slide them again. Make sure you don't twist your stitches up so that your brim or bottom of your work is going to stay nice and clean and even. All right, now at this point, you don't need to drop color number 2. You can just keep hanging on to it. But you'll pull very gently this cable through so that your needle is hooked through the other stitches on the back side. Turn your work, straighten your stitches. If you want to drop the color number 2, you can, but you don't have to at this point because you're going to continue to work with color number 2 on the second half of that piece. So now that we've got our stitches a little bit straight on the front needle, we pull the back needle through. Make sure you leave a little loop here so it doesn't lose your stitches. And you continue to work the pattern in color number 2. So we've got our knit purl for another 20 stitches. And knit, and one last purl with color number 2. And as you can see, that was the first completed row after the cast on for your color number 1. Now go ahead and drop color number 1, set it aside, or excuse me, drop color number 2, set that aside, and go back to color number 1, the blue, or ball number 1 if you're using the same color. Get your stitches in that color onto your needle and ready to work, and slide them down to the tip. Pick up the color and work the second half of the stitches for row 1 in your color number 1. So as you can see, color number 1 is always split, and you do the first half of the stitches, you drop that, pick up color number 2, work the entire row of stitches. Even though you're turning it in the middle, you're working it all the way through on color number 2. Then you go back to color number 1 and finish out the second half of the stitches. And that's how you'll do every single row in the same way. You always work half of color number 1, all of color number 2, and then the second half of color number 1. We've got our last knit and purl, and we've finished both row 1 for both little items we have here. This works the same way with mittens or anything else. You always work half of color number 1, move to color number 2, do all of color number 2, and then finish the second half of color number 1. Let me show you just one more time how you flip it. So when you're done with your first row, you do the same kind of flip. You can either pull your needle through now and then flip, or you can flip and pull your needle through. It depends on what you feel is easier. I like to flip and pull my needle through. Line both those needles up. And you're going to pull that back needle out again so that it's empty, and you can go back to working with color number 1. Again, when they get tangled, don't worry. Just untangle them carefully. And continue to work your pattern in the same way all the way around until you're finished.